I see we already have a guess in the chat for what the intro music was. You're close, not quite. I'm Eric Schumacher Rasmussen, and I am the conference chair for streaming media events. And I'm also the CMO of Ideas. Glad to be here for panel 3 of day 3 of our 8th Streaming Media Connect. We're going to be back in person in Huntington Beach for Streaming Media West in November. And the program just went live this week. Looking forward to being back in Huntington Beach and seeing everyone again. Boston was a great time for Streaming Media East. If you want to check out the program for Streaming Media West, it is online now. And Steve Nathans-Kelly just popped that link into the chat. Before we jump into our discussion for the next hour, a few housekeeping notes. Just for being here, you're entered into a random drawing for an Amazon gift card, and we'll announce the winner at the end of each session. If you have questions for our panel, please enter them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen rather than putting them in the chat. That way, we can keep better track of the questions, and they tend to kind of get lost if they get put in the chat. Panelists will answer the questions live at various points during the session. Andy, the moderator, will ask if there are any audience questions, and if there are, we'll take a break and ask those questions. Also, subtitles are turned on in Zoom. You may or may not see them at the moment. If you do see them and you don't want to or don't need to, you can go to the bottom of your screen, click on Live Transcript, and select Disable Transcript. Finally, all of these Streaming Media Connect sessions, as well as all of our other conference sessions, will be available on demand starting Monday on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/streamingmediavideo. I want to give a big thank you to Media Silo for sponsoring the entirety of Streaming Media Connect. And we have a brief video message from Media Silo right now. We're going to switch things up a little bit this next hour. Most of what we've talked about so far, at least when we're not talking technology at Streaming Media Connect this week, has been talking about the media and entertainment side of things. At Streaming Media East, we decided to bring back the enterprise and education video track. We hadn't had one of those in a while, and the response was so great, we decided it was time to make it a permanent part of our programming again. So we've got a session and it will be back at Streaming Media West. Andy Howard, our moderator today, is helping put together the enterprise and education track for Streaming Media West. And this next hour, he and our panelists will be talking about revolutionizing corporate communications and training, or should I say corporate communications beyond education and training. I looked at my notes and it wasn't there. So I'll just pass it over to Andy now because he knows what he's talking about. Andy, welcome.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate the opportunity to present today, and also at Streaming Media West. I cannot wait to get back out there, especially because I live in Connecticut and it's much nicer in California in November than it is here. Let me introduce our panelists today. We have Petar Mitrevski from Harvard Medical School, and also Tom Luciano from Cloud Media Lab at IBM. So if you guys could turn on your video and audio, we can get going here. All right, so let me just let you guys, well, first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Andy Howard, founder and managing director of Howard & Associates, which is a consulting company that helps organizations implement video communications. So video streaming, obviously, video conferencing, video control rooms, as well, digital signage, anything really video that happens in the enterprise we get involved in. And we've worked with a number of excellent clients that are doing very cutting edge streaming things, such as BlackRock, Deloitte, Aetna, Travelers, and also a lot of mid-sized companies and smaller companies as well. Petar, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm calling today from the Harvard Medical School, where I'm the Systems Integration Manager, and we work here with classrooms, conference rooms, event venues, using a lot of video technology.
Thank you. Tom, introduce yourself, please.
Yeah. Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Andy. I lead media tech and video production services for global sales enablement at IBM. So I represent our 25,000 sellers, making sure that they get the content that they need to stay up to date on the latest and greatest sales initiatives.
Great. All right, so we are going to keep this, mostly talking point, but I do have a couple slides just to sort of frame the conversation. So I'm going to share my screen here and show those to you. So we already did the panelists. So let's talk about the agenda here. So we want to talk about the the types of enterprise and educational streaming. Obviously, there's really two main types. One is internal. That is sort of what the industry has been built upon, where it's corporate communications, town halls, CEO broadcasts, training, those types of sort of standard enterprise streaming environments. But more recently, there's been a lot of more external focused content, talking with partners, suppliers, customers, whether there's webinars or other types of content, and we'll get into that. Then we'll talk about some sort of more unique applications that people might not have thought of or not know that other companies are doing or organizations are doing. And then we'll jump into ideas for the future. So in terms of the the internally focused things, I think Petar, in the last couple of years here, especially with the pandemic, at Harvard Medical School, they've been really focused on scaling up events. So I'll let you sort of talk to this slide and go from there.
Sure. Thank you, Andy. So right when the pandemic started, we were about to upgrade some of our larger event venues, and pandemic drove us to think a little out of the box. We had a little extra time to reconsider how we're going to design the new systems. And then we ended up using a software-defined video solution to do all the routing within these two event spaces, large event spaces, and then we added NDI. So this really allowed us to, during the pandemic, to continue to have classes and to be able to bring folks who were, we have a lot of researchers who had to be here physically on our campus, and connect them with all the events that were taking place virtually due to the pandemic. And thanks to the software-defined nature of the video and then NDI, we could take camera feeds from either amphitheater and have backups if something were to go wrong. And then typically they would get connected to a Zoom meeting, but there were situations where we essentially just used Zoom to produce a live stream that was then streamed to AWS and YouTube as well. Zoom gave us some really easy tools that our customers got used to using and sort of to produce the event, and that allowed us to have somewhat more interesting, innovative events. The benefits we saw also, we have to be fully compliant with accessibility here at Harvard. So captions and ASL interpreters could also be integrated in the platform this way and streamed live. The other thing that we wanted to cover is also for folks who didn't have enough bandwidth during the pandemic. Sometimes the buffering of the live stream often helped they could still watch the event with a little bit of a delay, but get value out of it. Yeah.
So for those in the audience that aren't familiar with SD, VOE and NDI, can you sort of just describe what
Sure.
those are?
Yeah, certainly. Thank you for prompting
And then
me.
I'm going to show the visual of what you're doing here.
The software-defined video just allows us to run the audio and the video over our network, and we can your network switch is essentially routing all the audio-video signals, and then you have decoders and encoders devices that are living there that lets you pretty much take any camera and send it to any output. Here we have examples of a Pearl and a TriCaster. Devices that both of them could pick up the signal from the network without having to run any dedicated wiring to them. So essentially, it significantly reduced the complexity of the system while giving us a lot of flexibility there.
Yeah, the typical, or I guess in sort of an older school environment, you would have a camera, maybe run an SDI cable all the way back to the control room. There would be a big video switcher that would route the signals. Now that can all be done over the network.
Yeah, essentially done by software. We're telling the encoders and decoders, the devices that sit behind the camera. Sometimes the cameras have a built-in encoder for NDI. We chose cameras that did have that. So then there's a decoder device at the other end that just picks up the stream from the camera over the network and defines the switching.
Okay. Tom, is there what are the sort of the trends you've seen from IBM in terms of large scale events, internal distribution, external distribution, reaching out to external constituents? Please provide your perspective there.
Yeah, it's been an interesting story here. So I've been in this space for 5 years, and I'd say 5 years ago when we were pitching even hybrid events, especially for training purposes. The way IBM worked 5 years ago is they'd fly hundreds of sellers down to a place, blast PowerPoints at them all day, and then fly them back home. My initiative was, hey, why don't we put production value around this? Why don't we cut this show in a way that looks like an NFL live show? I mean, everyone's familiar with that idea. So that caught on. And then the pandemic hit, and obviously I look like I prophesied something. So we architected essentially a virtual event solution from soup to nuts in terms of the platform all the way to the talent that's on screen for these things that are called sales kickoffs. We call them SKOs. And they're delivered every quarter to every seller in the company in kind of 3 events in a series. So it's between 5,000 and 10,000 sellers who attend those. And our chief revenue officer demanded that they were all live. So a lot of the people here could imagine that that's a big project, delivering that every 90 days. So the challenges that we ran into was, how do we keep people engaged for these 3-4 hours events? And how do we keep them entertained to make sure that they're there? Because we saw there was a pretty steep drop off after a certain point in time. So it's been a matter of working with different tools. Game show technology is something that we've really invested heavily in. VR, AR, I think we'll get to that later. And then animations, creating edutainment, as we call it, to keep the experience alive and bring some culture and bring some humanity to this space. Because going to an in-person event, it's very personal, and we're trying to bring that kind of human to human connection back. And the results have been really good. We've been really excited about what we've been working on. Learned a lot along the way, obviously.
So have they reduced the amount of in-person events to maybe one a year or something like that instead of one a quarter, or is it totally virtual now?
Yeah, I can't speak too much about what's coming out, but they're reducing the number of in-person events significantly. And I don't want to say it's entirely due to the success of this initiative, but it definitely had something to do with it. I wouldn't say it was a 0% influence. So yeah, the amount of in-person events has definitely gone down, and hybrid is becoming a thing that people are more familiar with. Watch parties has been a really cool things that have popped up. Like organically, sellers will hang out with their buddies at the office and watch our show, because that's what it is now. It looks closer to a late night talk show or a ESPN set as opposed to a Zoom presentation. Nothing against Zoom, but we're putting that production value around it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's definitely changing.
All right, great.
Yeah.
All right, so let's jump into sort of some of the unique newer applications that we've all been seeing out there. So the first one that I've seen is worked with a pharmaceutical company that was doing sales training, and not like the typical sales training that you would expect, where somebody's giving a presentation and people are consuming it, things like that. It was the salesperson would go into a room with it was a pharmaceutical company, so they were trying to refine how they spoke to the doctor. So there was an actor that was acting as a doctor, and the salesperson would deliver their pitch. They would go into the room, they would click on a button, everything would get recorded onto a server, and then right after the event, they would, the manager would come in and say, okay, here's what happened. You should have taken them down this line of questioning, or should have gone in this direction. So that's what I like to call the review the game tape type of application, for sort of a sports analogy. Tom, you had one for custom live stream game shows. Why don't you take us through that one a little bit more?
Yeah, the problem that we were trying to solve here was, how do we keep really large audiences engaged? And when we did a survey of what tools were out there, they all kind of tapped out at around 2,000, and there wasn't really a whole lot of design capabilities that allowed us to make this show feel like something special. So we brought together a series of tools and actors and producers and writers to produce a show that you might see on TV or a streaming network that's live, where we hired a host who has a Comedy Central half hour. He's seeing the feed of the chat. He sees who's getting the questions right in real time. He's kind of roasting the audience, or like kind of doing a little bit of work. Our producers have stingers queued up. I think everyone here might know what a stinger is, but if the audience does well, we have an Ice Baby stinger that comes in that's like a parody with, it's like IBMers Baby, you guys are ice cold kind of thing. So it's this real-time back and forth that allows us to interact with the audience, but kind of on the back end, this is our Trojan horse, as I call it. And some of our executives are like, why are you doing this? Why are you making a game show? We're getting real-time feedback on the initiatives and where the Salesforce's understanding is during the show, right? So we use that data to craft the next show, part one, and then part two is we can break, this is what we're working on now, but we can break it out by geo to give more granular sales reports and metrics to our executives. So the data is really what we're going after, kind of like how Tesla isn't a car company, they're a data company. Mm-hmm. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of cool stuff here. And these are now kind of something that we're doing it for other parts of the company. We're probably doing, about a half dozen of these a quarter, which has been really fun.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right, let's Petar, why don't you talk about, this is a really cool application, in my opinion. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the robot experience there at Harvard Medical School?
Sure. So we have a new lab that recently got some prototype style robots to sequence DNA, and we wanted to prevent the robot apocalypse because these are prototype robots. We don't want Terminator style issues happening. So we had to put some monitoring cameras for the robots, 2 cameras per robot. And we had to do this at a pretty short notice. The lab is bathed in UV light, so it's difficult, complicated to enter the lab in person and observe what's happening. There's a protocol for that. And if something went wrong, it was hard to see live what's happening and what the problem might be, and working with the manufacturer was a challenge. Anyhow, long story short, we had to retrofit the lab with some off-the-shelf HD webcams at short notice and attached to a PC with sufficient specs, 1 PC per robot. And then we're running a software from Panopto that lets us encode and stream that back to the Panopto platform in the cloud. And here we can view it live and switch between the cameras, or do side-by-side, picture-in-picture shots of what's happening in the room with the robots, but also record it so that we can then review with the manufacturer if there were any errors or problems. The software runs unattended, and like I said, streams to the cloud. And it's fully controlled by the cloud application, so minimal need to touch the PC computer. And then, because it was also the pandemic, we had researchers who were some at home, some in person, switching on a schedule. So this way, because it's a cloud platform, we could allow them to work from home and be able to see what's happening in the lab. And then the other nice side sort of benefit from this cloud platform was any streams can be archived based on policy of a certain number of days or weeks, and then they can be deleted. So we had to turn this around pretty quickly during the pandemic, and we just went with off-the-shelf things that were in stock. We have other applications where we similarly have monitoring cameras, streaming that were more what you would think typical PTZ cameras, connected some more typical streaming devices like the TriCaster or the EpiFan Pro. But in this case, we had to go fully software and use off-the-shelf things to get a product, get a solution in place during supply chain issues.
Now, are you able to control the robot so that, basically move it around and take it to where you need to show, a specific section of the room? Or
yes. So my understanding is the robots are relatively pre-programmed, and there is some limited capability to control them remotely, but they tend to use the smarts they have to sequence the DNA and move the various attachments, and that's all very automated based on what it sees on the table as far as materials. It's meant to be more automated, for lack of a better term.
Okay, that is very cool, and a great application, and something that is incredible that you can pull that off. When not very many people were there, and having supply chain issues and things like that. Eric, why don't we take a second here and see if there's any questions from the audience?
Just took a look, and actually there aren't any at the moment, but that's a good reminder that if you do want to, the chat's been active and audience members have been answering questions amongst themselves, helping clarify some of the terms, which has been really useful. But a reminder, if you have questions for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A tab. So back to you, Andy.
All right. So I'm going to chime in here for another one that I worked on. This was actually several years ago. Before, there's a lot of organizations now that are providing low latency streaming solutions. A number of them are sponsors of streaming media. But so this was about 5 years ago. I was approached by an online auction company they wanted to be able to stream their auctions because they were selling heavy equipment, like tractors, 18-wheeler trucks, things like that. And when they were able to bring on an online audience, it increased their revenues substantially, and sometimes up to 40%, because if there's only one or two bidders on these things, if you just add a third bidder, it can really increase the audience size. And their goal at the time was to get it under 2 seconds of latency, or get it to 2 seconds of latency, which we were able to do. Was there was a lot of sort of custom work to make that happen. They were using Flash at the time. I'm assuming that they've gone to a newer technology at this point. But and there's a variety of other online auction companies now or auction companies that have taken their solutions online that I know of as well. So the next one is clinical assessment. So this is sort of simulation training in medical and nursing schools. And I'm going to let Petar talk about that, because he is obviously very knowledgeable about that particular solution. I'm
going to quickly answer one of the questions that came in live for me. But there were not sort of latency requirements for the DNA robots because they were pretty automated. If something went wrong, and there wouldn't be anything catastrophic, thankfully. But we want to capture that and see it first, even if there was some delay, and just make sure we've captured it, and we can then review it with the manufacturer. Yeah. In terms of the clinical training we do here, we have two applications. One is an older application where a patient actor comes in, pretends to be a patient with an illness, and the medical students have to go through and basically treat them as if they were their attending physician. We have a room set up for this that look like hospital rooms. The trick is that the rooms are equipped with cameras and microphones, allowing a faculty member, a professor, to see how the student is interacting with the patient. And then, as Andy mentioned earlier, this is also recorded, so you can review the tape after the fact, so to say, and give specific feedback. That's been happening here for a very long time. We are actually in the process of converting that clinical skills center and upgrading it with newer technology, but pretty much the same approach. We don't stream this publicly, and it's not really for internal communication, but it's really useful for the teaching of our students. And it's a streaming technology with some specialized software for essentially clinical skills training. The other live clinical training application we do is related to surgeries and anatomy. So we have anatomy labs where there are live prosections. During the pandemic, some of our students were forced to learn from home, and to assist that, we had to quickly equip our very sort of traditional anatomy labs with some streaming equipment. Thankfully, the labs had already some computers there that were available, typically used to look up anatomy atlases and manuals and such, but in this case, we repurposed them for streaming so that we could stream the class live. And then because some of the findings were small during the class, we had to give the ability for the professor to take a camera and go close. So we see here, it's a webcam on a grip handle. And again, this is during the pandemic, had to be simple. And this was also ended up being used by the students. When they had a question, they could point at what they had a question about, and because we're streaming this to the lab where the professor is, the professor could see what was being discussed, and could then come back and attend to that group of students. This is a series of 8 labs essentially, and with restrictions on campus, we often had a small number of faculty and students spread across the labs. It was very successful. We're actually now looking at taking this approach and going with more commercial grade equipment. and providing also some PTZ cameras in the ceiling that could be controlled by foot pedals and such, allowing a professor to, without having to touch anything, zoom in on a particular feature and stream that out to classrooms. So this is upstairs in our one of our teaching buildings, and downstairs are labs where first-year students can get sort of real-time experience of how a prosection or surgery might go.
Wow, that's very interesting. So they would, if they needed to zoom in on something, they would actually grab this
They
handle
would physically grab
and take
it.
the camera and go around.
Exactly. And we will still need to retain something similar, or perhaps go with a head-worn style camera.
Oh, okay.
Because it's sometimes for certain organs, you have to get at it from a particular angle, and a fixed camera that, sure, it can pan, tilt, and zoom, but sometimes you need to get a different angle on the particular feature that you're observing.
Sure. Okay, great. I did see another question come in about low latency. Tom, is IBM using any low latency video tools in your solutions, or is it really more traditional streaming?
It's more traditional streaming. We are standardized on Watson Media, which was Heritage Ustream. It's a combination of other tools as well. For the game show that I was talking about before, we have ways that we're looking into for low latency, but we haven't gotten there yet. It's on our roadmap.
On our end, when we've had to do anything with low latency, we've typically used the Wowza platform, which has some ability to reduce the latency. Thankfully, it hasn't been a requirement to a great extent for us. And then in situations where we do need something low latency, we typically fall back to using a Zoom webinar, essentially, to deliver.
I was going to say the same thing about the question was really about, if you're doing video presentations, slides, and chat, Zoom and Microsoft Teams, live events, and WebEx has live events, because those are really video conferencing type tools that have low delay in general, and they're sort of expanding that to a larger audience. Those tools are great for that. But if there's, specifications for, very low latency, there's different providers that, and there's great information on this on, streamingmedia.com regarding, the different providers. But I know there's like Millicast, who I think was just purchased by Dolby, Nanocosmos, Wowza. There's a whole variety of providers that are looking to really scale the low latency solutions in a streaming type environment.
I'm seeing Troy's question about how are we doing this with the standard latency. Process is what we've done. So we've baked it in at the delay level. And it's been a lot of playing around, troubleshooting before the shows, obviously. So the way that it works is the way that we have it configured right now, it's a 2-screen setup. So the audience, when the game show kicks off, takes out their phone, pulls up the QR code, and then the phone aligns with the game show questions that pop up. So those two things have to get aligned. So depending on the quarter, the latency can be different. Depending on the day, it can be different. So we're typically baking in that latency so the two sides of the house line up, if that makes sense.
And I was going to say also, in a lot of sort of webinar, webcast environments, people are very concerned about latency, but unless you're trying to, add live video or live audio questions and answers, the latency, as long as you're not doing like a minute, type latency, you can get it down to 10 seconds or something like that. If the questions and answers are coming in, via Q&A or chat, the latency is really not that big of a deal. Because it doesn't need to be necessarily, synchronous. All right, so a couple more examples that I had were control rooms and surveillance types of environments. There's a lot of typically a control room was you got a big screen up on the wall. You've got people at operator stations that are doing different looking at different video feeds and things like that. But it was typically contained just to that room. Now there's solutions where you can stream that out to remote people. So obviously this was important during the pandemic when not everybody could be in a control room or be together. But it also now adds, the ability to send, surveillance feeds to, for example, to the fire department, to the police department, to to the government if it was a terrorist type thing. So there's a lot of great applications there where you can expand the reach of things. And then I used to work for a company called Debrick Systems a long time ago. We did a lot with the military. They still are, and there's High Vision does the same thing, where they will stream battlefield video or battlefield training video to people all over the world. So those are a couple of great applications as well. All right, so let's go to where do we go from here? So Tom, you have a number of sort of initiatives on your side. So I'll let you jump in here on a couple of these at this point.
Yeah, I'll start with the edutainment, and that's probably more of the hippy dippy side of what we do, but I think it's something important to consider with the virtual events in general, is how do you keep the audience engaged and connected? Because I tell this to our executive team, if people aren't watching, they definitely aren't learning. If they're not watching, they're definitely not remembering what you're doing. So we have designed a series of educational, we've designed a series of content that is closer to South Park, closer to Book of Mormon, that educates as we entertain. And we actually won a couple of Telly Awards for that. It's been in development for a couple of years, so it's a kind of crazy offshoot of what we do, but it's been super successful to the point where our CEO is putting it in his messaging. When we do in-person events and these watch parties, there's figurines of this action hero series that we've done. So it's been a cultural touch point for the company. It's been a surprising revelation. And it's helped us keep people on the streams, which is probably the most important part, because people are asking, when's the animation coming? When are we seeing Pipey? That's our main character. He's the sales pipeline mascot, basically. So that's what I see is the kind of the future is you're competing with TikTok, you're competing with Instagram, whether you know it or not. I mean, my phone's right here. We're all addicted to our phones. We have YouTube at our fingertips, like one click away. So as we're making stuff, I encourage my team to think about, would you watch this? Do you care about this? And kind of baking that into everything that we do from a technical perspective in terms of things like latency to just how are we directing, designing, animating our stuff. So that's at a high level. I'll stop there before I go into AR and VR and kind of the Unreal Engine. But does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Petar, is there any new applications on the horizon that you guys are thinking about?
I mean, similar to I think it will tie in more in the VR, AR area. Yeah. I'll let Tom cover that.
So with VR and AR, we're scratching the surface here, but it was in line with what we were talking about before in terms of, what the military is doing on the battlefield, or even with Petar in terms of how are you taking people through simulations. But yeah, the virtual reality sales environment is what we're working on right now, and all of the hardware and software that goes into it. Can't speak too much about it at this point, but we're kind of exploring all avenues there. And
Okay.
the video game development goes in with that. I mean, they're kind of one and the same. Building in Unreal Engine, and making environments that are interactive and scalable. I mean, that's kind of been the most difficult bridge to cross. Are we sending out? This is a conversation I had yesterday. Are we sending out 10,000 headsets to people? And the answer is no. Are we bringing people into the office and then someone has to clean these headsets, the hygiene perspective? The most likely answer is we're probably doing, the Google Cardboard that people can put their phone into and move around the space and interact with that. But that's definitely in our roadmap in the next 3 to 6 months.
Yeah, I think, when people think about virtual reality, I think that they think like you go into this sort of virtual world and you've got an avatar or things like that. But there are actually pretty cool applications. I guess this would fall more into the, AR or augmented reality realm, where like I saw that one company at Infocom had these giant screens that could go behind the speaker. So it was like a green screen type environment, but it looked like the person was actually in the factory or in wherever they were, and they could walk around and sort of interact with what was going on there, even though they weren't actually there. And then they could stream that out all as one video, and it looked like the person was actually there. I thought that was super cool. I've also been working with this is more video conferencing focused, but I've been working with a company called Common Ground that's sort of still in stealth mode, but their idea is that instead of having sort of like what your typical Zoom, Hollywood Squares type environment, that you want to be able to come in and meet with people and be in sort of a meeting room environment. So it takes your video and creates a very lifelike avatar, and then it's like you're sitting around a table with other people. So that if I look left and Petar's over there, then I'm talking to him, I'm looking straight at him. And same thing, if I look right and Tom's over there, that I'm talking to him. So I think there's some really cool applications that I can't certainly envision all of them right now, but that will be coming down the pipe from that perspective. Tom, did you want to talk about video game development, or did you cover that already?
I covered that under VR, AR.
Okay.
I'd say around AR, what I've heard interest around Harvard Medical School is can we have a system where students can manipulate a virtual organ using some sort of either combination of glasses or a display and gloves or some sort of controller, so that they're essentially using their hands to do digital procedures on virtual patients. We don't have an application. I just know it's been discussed. We tend to have enough donations for working on real life bodies that have been donated. So there hasn't been pressure, but I know it's been discussed as one potential option.
Yeah, I mean, I could see also, from a streaming perspective, sort of the professor, holding a virtual heart or something like that, and really, being able to rotate it and say, here's the ventricles and, all that kind of stuff. You see that quite a bit also with sort of product design, where, they might be creating a new vehicle or something like that, and they want to, put it into sort of 3-dimensional, so you could rotate it and say, here's the, the lines of the car and things like that, and then be able to deliver that out to multiple people to view what's going on there. Let's see, we got one more question. Oh no, we've already answered that question. All right, so is there any any other things you see, envision your organizations implementing in the future that we haven't covered yet?
As I'm thinking for Harvard, at least, there will be some focus in the coming years on devices that can do streaming, and encoders essentially that can do streaming, but can also double for production purposes. So we can do some green screen, lower thirds and such, but also be able to bring in virtual participants there. And right now, we can do that, combination of plugins, sometimes using OBS, but we're hoping there's going to be products that are easier, where you can do sort of a mixed, a little more easier, a little more off the shelf. You can do a mixed event where you're taking in maybe an in-person panel, bringing in a remote panelist there, and then you can do some clever editing or basic editing to make it look like everyone's on the same table or in the same room, and stream that back out to the audience. We definitely, that we're getting a lot more remote speakers now rather than bringing folks in. There's encouragement for people to return back to the office, return back to the campus. So we'll need to find ways to keep the remote and the in-person people engaged during an event. So, yeah.
Yeah, to go off what Petar mentioned there, for me, it's more of a staffing conversation than anything else as it pertains to technology and training. But what I'm seeing is I'm fielding pitches from vendors all the time in terms of, here's what we're doing, here's how we can work with you. But the time to value of a junior producer for me, someone who doesn't know OBS but can produce a show, I think is kind of the next frontier, because the design of these shows is pretty manual. The cutting of the show is pretty manual, and it takes a lot of time to actually make sure that all of those nuts and bolts are in place if you're going to put something together for 5,000 or 10,000 people. So that's becoming very quickly more self-service on the producer side. I'm sure everyone here has heard of Hopin and StreamYard, but Hopin acquired StreamYard, I think, for that almost exact purpose, so that it can be more self-service from the marketing department's point of view, as opposed to hiring someone who's a technical director who's using vMix or OBS or Wirecast, whatever it may be. So that's moving quick. It's going to change how I'm staffing my team. I'm not going to need as many technical directors pretty soon, I think.
Yeah, so for those that don't know, like Hopin, there's just a ton of different providers that provide sort of live event services. So that's sort of either it's a fully virtual environment or it's a hybrid environment where it's more like a trade show or a conference type environment. So you go into the environment, there's, you're in the lobby, you can watch the keynote session, you can go visit exhibitors, there's networking. There's always obviously a live video component of that for the keynotes. And then there's on-demand content that can either, roll from the live to the on-demand, or just, people providing on-demand content to, to the audience. And there's a variety of providers out there that are doing that. Like WebEx just bought Socio. There's Hopin. There's just a variety of different providers there. I think that will be more and more popular going forward too, especially even for trade shows and conferences where they want to. They might not have as big of an in-person audience as they once had, but in order to to be able to justify the event, that they can also have an online audience. So it really ends up being a hybrid type environment.
Yeah, hybrid's really interesting too. We haven't figured that out yet. It's one of the biggest requests that we get. We have half the people in person at this location, and then we have a distributed audience. How do we merge those two to make them feel like one, or get a similar result? But there's a lot of different configurations and a lot of different technology that we've been playing with.
Yeah, and there's certainly different levels that you can take that as to how sophisticated you want it to be, and how much you want to spend on it. All right, so I'm looking at the questions now. There was, did you ever have what well, that didn't work moment that led to a new way of thinking about things or doing things?
Yeah, a couple of those for sure. In the earlier days of the pandemic, we tried to do things with streaming using some off-the-shelf equipment that didn't work great. And examples of trying to take a tool and make it do something it really wasn't meant to do usually fell apart. It kind of led us towards going to simpler solutions, which is why you saw webcams on hand grips. So we tried GoPros and tried a couple other tools, did some more professional camcorders, streaming over Wi-Fi. There were some challenges there. So we ended up with wired webcams with an extension cord for a reason there.
Yeah, I'd say the same. I mean, trying to push more prosumer technology into enterprise situations has led to some interesting situations. It's happened to us a few times. And we were just put in those situations because, the requirements of the project changed quickly and people don't understand that you need time and train people to do things a certain way. So if anything, it's just taught me to really, in my contracts, to make sure that we have stuff like that scoped and it's clear ahead of time. I mean, that's probably the biggest thing I've learned from the oh crap moments is really being clear up front in terms of what the requirements are and what it means if you, as the client, change your requirements within certain timeframes, budget considerations, staffing, and the more we explain that to them up front, the better these projects tend to go.
Yeah, I'll give my own experience, which wasn't we were doing a webcast and had redundancy built in everywhere. We thought there's no way that this could go wrong. We had multiple encoders, multiple different networks going out the internet, and then there was a lightning strike and the power went off and there was no power in the building, so the whole thing was just so there's some things you just can't plan around, I think. All right, so there's another question here about do you guys utilize encryption or watermarking for your assets?
Certainly for the research video that we are recording, that is encrypted in transit and then at rest. It's built into the platform. That being said, it's only certified for certain level of data. If there was an earlier question of recording animal subjects, we can't do that. Now, it's fine in this case because it's robots and there's no one in the lab, so there's no personal identifiable information on screen. But if it was animals or people, we wouldn't be allowed to use this particular platform, and we'd have to go to something more expensive to do that. But we certainly do encrypt. That's been a requirement. We don't watermark our assets, though. That's not a requirement here.
Yeah, no watermarking on our side. We're locked into Watson Media. That's we're required to use that because it's an IBM product. And I'm sure they could speak more to the encryption, but that's typically done at the CIO level, the corporate headquarter level, so I'm sure it's done in some way. But yeah, security considerations and everything's confidential that we produce, which makes things often more complicated than they need to be. So we have those conversations from time to time.
Yeah, I think my experience is most enterprises want to ensure that the content's encrypted, certainly when it's in flight, most often when it's at rest, but like go into DRM or something like that, which is, like a media and entertainment company might do, is just too complicated, too costly, and most enterprises do not want to go to that length to protect their content. All right, so final question here is, how do you typically offer your assets for the repurposing or consumption? Is it an OBP or something else? I think Petar, you mentioned your solution a little bit, and I think Tom is, I'm pretty clear what you probably use.
Yeah, we do use an online video platform. With so many events happening on Zoom, a lot of our customers use Zoom's recording functionality, and that's pretty rudimentary. But for the stuff we produce, it tends to go into our online video platform, which is Panopto, or for more public things, it goes onto the university's YouTube channel.
But do you have with the Zoom recordings could also go into Panopto, right?
There's in fact an integration, so certain things could automatically go into Panopto and be, get some editing there if needed, or set a life cycle for them essentially. Yeah.
I cut out there for a minute, but how do we prevent repurposing? Is that the question? Content?
No, how do we repurpose it for consumption?
Yeah.
Repurpose it.
What's your online video platform, which I would assume you guys use IBM Video Cloud?
Yeah, Watson Media.
Or Watson Media.
Is, and then repurposing. I mean, everyone in the company has access to the content, so they can distribute it however they want across all of the different directories and dashboards. So we give them a link. The editing is pretty much locked down from an admin perspective. You need to be a producer to kind of chop it up and use it in your own way. It's pretty standard.
Okay, well, I think we've run up to our time here. I want to thank Tom and Petar for great insights and really interesting applications. I learned a lot today myself. So I'm going to hand it back to Eric. And again, I hope to see a lot of you that are online out in Streaming Media West. I'm excited about that.
Yeah, we're all excited about Huntington Beach, like you said, especially those of us who live in colder climates. But I'm also specifically excited that we're going to have that enterprise and education video track again. And again, if you're interested in speaking, please contact me. If you want to register, you can go to the streamingmedia.com/West website. Thanks to both of our panelists. Thanks, Andy, for moderating. Thanks to our audience. Speaking of audience, it's time to give away that Amazon gift card. And Mike Fitzpatrick correctly identified Billy Preston's Out of Space first, so he gets the gift card. Mike, keep an eye out on your email for that. Thanks again to Media Silo for sponsoring these 3 days of sessions. We've got the next session coming up in about 30 minutes. It's going to be focusing on delivering the optimal live experience at scale from Daniel Perea at System 73. So we'll see you then. Thanks so much.
Thank you.